There is a strange void hidden between two of the most important leaps in human evolution. A silent interval stretching tens of thousands of years where the human brain stopped expanding, tools barely changed, and traces of modern behavior almost entirely vanished from the archaeological record. What remains is an eerie stillness, an evolutionary standstill so sharp, so abrupt, that many researchers no longer see it as a simple gap in data. To them, it looks deliberate, almost engineered, as if an entire stage of humanity's development had been quietly erased. When this anomaly was first discovered, scientists assumed it was just a consequence of missing fossils. But the deeper they dug, through sediments, through genetic markers, through prehistoric layers undisturbed for millennia, the clearer the pattern became. The gap was not messy or blurred, as natural evolutionary slowdowns usually are. It was precise, clean, a pause that should not exist. One paleoanthropologist famously said, "It's like the first chapter of our story was torn out, and everything from chapter 2 onward no longer makes complete sense." What makes this silence even more unsettling is what came before it. Right before the standstill, humans were accelerating, brains growing faster than expected, tool-making becoming surprisingly refined, and faint signs of symbolic behavior emerging in unlikely places. These were not the actions of a primitive species fumbling its way forward. They hinted at a rapid evolutionary surge. And then, everything froze, overnight, as if some invisible hand reached down and halted the trajectory we were on. Some researchers argue that the environment may have shifted. Others say genetic bottlenecks or climate events could explain the stagnation. But none of those theories account for the sharpness of the pause, nor the strange consistency across distant regions. It's as though humanity, scattered across continents, collectively hit the same evolutionary wall at the same moment. And walls, unlike random fluctuations, suggest something was standing in the way. Modern genetic studies add another layer to the mystery. A peculiar pattern appears in ancient DNA, hints of lost diversity, traces of an early lineage far more advanced than expected, and sudden disappearances that cannot be fully explained by natural selection alone. It's as if there was once a branch of humanity undergoing a dramatic ascent, faster, smarter, more capable. But that branch vanished so completely that only faint echoes remain in our genes. These subtle fragments behave like ghosts of a forgotten population, one that may have evolved beyond its time before being wiped out, or intentionally removed. As we assemble the scattered pieces, a troubling possibility emerges. Human evolution didn't slow down on its own. It was interrupted. Something, whether a catastrophic event, an unknown force, or a forgotten civilization, reset the trajectory of our story species. The evidence doesn't scream, it whispers, hiding in the margins of ancient bones and the silent spaces between our DNA. And the more we uncover, the clearer it becomes that this standstill was not the end of a chapter, but the beginning of a mystery that has followed humanity ever since. As scientists examined the silence in our evolutionary timeline, they expected randomness, an uneven scatter of artifacts, fragmented signs of early human life, the usual chaos of prehistory. Instead, they found patterns, repeating patterns, patterns that should not exist across continents that had no contact with one another. Stone tools from Africa, the Levant, and Southeast Asia all began showing the same stagnation at roughly the same period, as though different human groups, separated by deserts, oceans, and tens of thousands of miles, collectively stopped progressing at once. But evolution does not freeze in synchronization, not across such vast distances. not without a force strong enough to shape every population simultaneously. The question was not simply why humans stopped evolving. The question became, who or what benefited from this pause? The deeper archaeologists dug, the more unsettling the clues grew. They found sites where early humans had mastered techniques centuries ahead of their neighbors, only for that knowledge to vanish without passing on. They found bone structures from certain populations that hinted at sudden spikes in neural complexity, then abrupt reversions to more primitive forms. What could cause a lineage to advance so rapidly, only to collapse back into simplicity? A few fringe researchers proposed that an early civilization, one predating every known culture, might have emerged, flourished briefly, and then disappeared so thoroughly that history forgot it existed. For years, this idea was dismissed as speculation, but new genetic data revived the possibility. In some ancient lineages, scientists found what they called ghost alleles, genetic fragments that did not match any known human, Neanderthal, or Denisovan lineage. These fragments suggested an unknown population, one that diverged early and developed differently, perhaps even more rapidly. And then, just as mysteriously, they vanished. It was as if a branch of humanity had climbed further up the ladder than the rest of us, glimpsed a higher form of existence, and then was erased, leaving only faint echoes behind. Whether this disappearance was natural or engineered remains the great, unanswered question. Climate records complicate things further. Some regions show evidence of severe ecological disruption, megadroughts, megafloods, temperature collapses, that could have forced populations to retreat or die out. Yet other regions, at the exact same time, show stability and abundance. If climate were the cause, its effects should not be this selective. Instead, it looks almost like the collapse targeted only those groups undergoing accelerated evolution. Even the fossils themselves hint at something amiss. Skeletons from the period before the standstill sometimes display asymmetry in bone density, unusual cranial features, and stress markers inconsistent with known prehistoric environments. Some paleoanthropologists have quietly suggested that these populations faced pressures unlike anything found in nature, pressures that halted their development, forced regression, or eliminated them entirely. But buried among the ruins and the teeth and the fragments of tools lies something even stranger. Signs that early humans might have been more interconnected than we think, not through trade or travel, but through something intangible. An idea, a fear, or perhaps a memory that crossed continents without leaving physical traces. Could the pause reflect a sudden shift in behavior, driven by a shared perception of danger, something the entire species sensed but could not record? It is here, at the edge of what we know and what we fear, that the greatest mystery begins to take shape. Because if an advanced branch of early humans once existed, and if they vanished during the evolutionary standstill, then the silence that followed was not a coincidence. It was the aftermath of something far larger, something powerful enough to reset the course of our species. And as the evidence accumulates, one disturbing possibility emerges. Maybe humanity did not stop evolving because it reached its limits. Maybe it stopped because something else reached us first. To understand why humans may have stopped evolving, we must first examine what came before the silence, those brief moments in deep prehistory when humanity seemed to surge forward, then abruptly fall back. In caves scattered across Africa and Eurasia, archaeologists discovered artifacts that did not fit neatly into the evolutionary timeline. A finely crafted tool buried beneath layers of crude stone flakes, pigments arranged in deliberate patterns long before symbolic art should have existed, fragments of bone displaying cranial proportions more advanced than surrounding populations. These anomalies were dismissed for decades as outliers, mistakes, or misinterpretations. but taken together, they form a pattern too coherent to ignore. Across thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years, small pockets of early humans appeared to leap ahead, developing skills, behaviors, and even physical traits that should have taken millennia to evolve. It was as if isolated sparks were lighting across the prehistoric world, each representing a potential breakthrough. And yet none of these sparks caught fire. None spread. None changed the broader human story. The question is why? Evolution rarely produces advancements that disappear without a trace. Once a beneficial trait emerges, it tends to propagate, unless something stops it. Yet again and again, advancements flared into existence only to be extinguished. Consider the enigmatic tool assemblages in southern Africa dating back nearly 300,000 years. Blades, sharper and more symmetrical than anything found for the next 100,000 years. Or the early symbolic markings in Blombos Cave that suddenly vanished for tens of millennia before reappearing as if humanity had rediscovered something it already knew. These were not slow, wandering progressions. They were flashes, too advanced, too sudden, too isolated. Some researchers proposed that these early groups were experimenting with entirely new ways of thinking, abstract reasoning, long-term planning, perhaps even early forms of social complexity that we don't yet understand. But if that were true, why did none of their innovations reshape human history? One disturbing possibility is that these groups did not disappear naturally. Something may have intervened, an event, a force, or another intelligence that halted their trajectory. Not by wiping out humanity entirely, but by selectively eliminating those who advanced too quickly. This hypothesis gained traction when geneticists identified a mysterious pattern in ancient DNA. Certain lineages appeared to flourish briefly, show signs of rapid adaptation, and then suddenly collapse, leaving only diluted remnants in surviving populations. These ghost lineages hinted at a population that may have evolved differently, perhaps faster than the rest of Homo sapiens. Their disappearance was not gradual. It was abrupt, leaving behind just enough evidence to prove they once existed, but not enough to explain what happened to them. Even more unsettling are the geographical correlations. Many of the sites where these evolutionary leaps occurred sit near tectonic faults, volcanic regions, or places associated with sudden environmental change. Did natural disasters target only the most advanced populations? Unlikely. The distribution is too selective, too patterned. It feels less like nature's randomness and more like a reset. Precise, strategic, intentional. The anomalies extend beyond tools and bones. Some cave systems contain layers of ash from fires far hotter than those early humans should have been capable of producing. Others show signs of large-scale abandonment, as if entire groups fled overnight. And in rare cases, burial sites include individuals with cranial capacities slightly larger than average, as if evolution had briefly accelerated before being forced to retreat. These fragments of evidence whisper a single, haunting idea. Early humanity may have approached a threshold, an unseen limit after which something intervened. A point where evolution was no longer merely biological, but began brushing against something else, something that reacted. If a forgotten civilization once existed, more advanced than we assume, perhaps it emerged during one of these early leaps. Perhaps it thrived just long enough to become a threat. And perhaps the silence that followed was not the absence of progress, but the aftermath of an encounter we no longer remember. As researchers sift deeper through ancient layers of human prehistory, a troubling consistency begins to emerge. The populations that displayed sudden leaps in cognition, tool-making, or social structure often vanished without leaving a cultural legacy. They did not expand, did not dominate neighboring groups, and did not evolve into more complex societies. Instead, they left behind only hints, ghost tools, anomalous bones, fragments of pigments that suggest they were on the verge of something extraordinary. But something stopped them. The more scientists map these ancient disappearances, the more they notice a pattern in the timing. Each leap forward occurs during periods of environmental stability, a time when evolution should thrive. Yet immediately following these advances, the archaeological record plunges into silence. No new tools, no new behaviors, no sign that the innovation ever existed. It is as if humanity stepped toward a doorway, glimpsed what lay beyond, and then recoiled, or was pulled back. Some anthropologists argue that these early groups may have become isolated, unable to compete with surrounding populations, and eventually died out. But the genetic evidence contradicts this explanation. Certain traits associated with these advanced groups, subtle neural markers, metabolic adaptations, even rare blood variants, should have persisted if they interbred with others. Yet, instead of spreading, these traits vanish almost entirely. It is as though these populations were removed from the gene pool with surprising efficiency. One controversial hypothesis suggests that an early, now lost civilization may have emerged during one of these evolutionary surges. It would not have resembled modern civilizations with cities, writing, or metallurgy. Instead, it could have been a cognitively advanced society, capable of abstract thought, long-term planning, and perhaps a rudimentary form of scientific observation. If such a civilization existed, even briefly, it might have stood apart from neighboring groups, evolving along a trajectory that diverged from the rest of humanity. But if it truly existed, why is there no clear trace? Why were its ideas, innovations, and genetic signatures erased so completely? Some believe a catastrophic event wiped it out: volcanic eruptions, sudden climate collapse, or pandemics stronger than anything experienced since. Yet none of these explanations fully align with the precise disappearance of the advanced lineages. Natural disasters do not selectively target the most cognitively developed populations. They do not erase only the groups that were ahead, and they do not produce the eerie synchronicity seen across continents. Others propose a more unsettling possibility: that this lost civilization may have isolated itself intentionally, withdrawing from contact or visibility, only to be overwhelmed by a force they could not escape. Evidence from certain cave systems shows sudden abandonment at a scale that suggests flight, not migration, but escape. Scorched chambers, tools left mid-process, unfinished carvings abruptly halted. It's as if something approached and they ran. What they ran from is unknown, but the reaction was universal. The silence that follows these sites feels less like extinction and more like suppression, as if knowledge itself had been buried. Not only did the advanced groups disappear, but surrounding populations seem to have avoided their former territories for thousands of years. The land became a blank space on the human map, a region where evolution had accelerated too quickly and paid a price. When populations eventually returned to these regions, they brought no memory of the ones who came before. No stories, no myths, no continuity. It is a clean break, a reset that wiped both biology and culture. What kind of event has the power to erase not only people, but the ideas they carried? As we trace the fading footprints of these early lineages, one conclusion becomes difficult to ignore. Human evolution did not stop by accident. Something intervened, something powerful enough to halt progress, erase knowledge, and remove entire branches of humanity from existence. Whether it was a forgotten civilization, a natural force we still cannot comprehend, or an encounter lost to memory, the evidence draws us toward a single disturbing truth. The standstill in our evolution may not mark a failure of humanity to advance. It may mark the moment humanity was reset.
If humanity was reset,
The next question is inevitable. What remnants, if any, survived the reset? Not all traces of a lost epoch vanish cleanly. Occasionally, they slip through the cracks of time, preserved in fragments of myth, unexplained symbols, or artifacts far older than they should be. These echoes are scattered across the world, separated by oceans and ages, yet strangely unified by recurring themes. A people who came before, a fall that no one can fully describe, and a knowledge that vanished in a single night. Among the San people of southern Africa, the oldest cultural lineage on Earth, there are stories of the first ones, not ancestors, but beings who walked differently, thought differently, and left before the world hardened. In Australia, Aboriginal traditions speak of an age when humans possessed abilities that were taken away so that the world could follow its proper path. Even in early Mesopotamian myths, the idea appears again. Rulers who reigned impossibly long ages before history began, as though they belonged to another version of humanity altogether. These myths, when viewed individually, seem symbolic, but when lined up beside one another, they form a mosaic, a global memory of an earlier humanity that advanced too quickly, only to be extinguished or concealed. Archaeology adds new layers to this puzzle. Excavations in Central Africa uncovered stone structures that predate known cultures by tens of thousands of years, arranged with a precision difficult to attribute to purely primitive hands. In India, at the submerged site of Dwarka, researchers found architectural patterns that should not exist at their depth or age. And on the Arabian Peninsula, a region long assumed to be a barren corridor of migration, ancient hearths and tools hint at communities far more organized than expected. But the most intriguing finds are those that do not fit anywhere. Objects that appear abruptly and disappear just as quickly, leaving no technological lineage. In a cave in Namibia, archaeologists found pigments mixed with a binder that should have required a complex recipe, a kind of early chemistry. In Siberia, bone fragments suggest a group with cranial shapes slightly more globular than other humans of their time, a subtle sign of different neural development. In Southeast Asia, a set of tools shows symmetry and refinement that would not appear again for tens of millennia. These artifacts are like whispers from a forgotten chapter, evidence that an early, cognitively advanced population may have existed in scattered pockets across the world. Not enough to create sprawling cities or monumental architecture, but enough to form the foundations of a civilization built on intellect rather than industry. Yet every one of these traces is isolated. No progression, no continuity, no cultural descent. It is as if these groups reached upward too quickly, touching something humanity was not meant to touch at that stage. And the world responded by swallowing them. Whether this response was environmental, biological, or something more mysterious remains a matter of debate. But the consistency of the disappearance cannot be ignored. One of the most puzzling patterns comes from burial sites. Certain individuals show signs of deliberate positioning, as though their communities regarded them differently. Some are buried with pigments, beads, or objects not found in ordinary graves. Their bones often display atypical features, increased cranial capacity, unusual wear indicating repetitive fine motor activity, or stress markers associated with intense mental tasks. Some paleoanthropologists quietly refer to them as the thinkers, the population who may have developed cognitive abilities that set them apart. But these thinkers vanish from the record as abruptly as they appear. Even more strange is the presence of cultural void zones, regions where evidence of human occupation suddenly stops for thousands of years. These empty landscapes, once thriving with early human life, become silent. No tools, no fires, no bones. It's as if humanity collectively avoided these places long after the advanced groups disappeared, as though the land itself carried a memory of something unsettling. Taken together, these scattered clues paint a chilling picture. Traces of a forgotten people, too advanced for their time, erased so thoroughly that even their shadows barely remain. Yet their echoes persist, in myths, in anomalies, in genes, hinting at a version of humanity that reached a higher potential before the reset pulled them back. If these ancient people truly existed, the next question is even more disturbing. What triggered the reset that wiped them from the world? And why did it leave the rest of us behind? If echoes of a forgotten people still linger in fossils and myths, the environment they lived in must also hold clues. Ancient landscapes are not silent. They remember. Sediment layers preserve the rhythm of vanished climates, and within those layers lie patterns that hint at something dramatic, an upheaval that struck precisely when early humans were pushing the limits of their cognitive evolution. Across Africa, Eurasia, and even the remote Pacific fringes, researchers found something strange: synchronized environmental anomalies. Not vast, planet-shaking apocalypses, but sudden, localized disruptions, just large enough to destabilize advanced groups, yet not severe enough to affect humanity as a whole. A rapid cooling in one region, unexplained flooding in another, abrupt vegetation shifts in yet another. No global pattern, no worldwide catastrophe. Instead, a surgical scattering of disruptions, almost targeted in their precision. Natural events are rarely this selective. The most advanced clusters of early humans, those showing signs of refined tools, symbolic behavior, and possible social complexity, seem to overlap suspiciously with zones of abrupt ecological collapse. It is almost as if evolution placed them on the verge of breakthrough, and then the environment erased the stage beneath their feet. Some researchers believe these collapses were the result of volcanic activity or sudden shifts in rainfall patterns, but the geological record reveals a more unsettling detail. Many of these disruptions leave behind unusually thin event layers. They happened quickly, too quickly, like a sudden shock rather than a prolonged climatic drift. When these groups disappeared, the surrounding populations did not expand into their territories for thousands of years. Instead, vast tracts of land became dead zones in the archaeological record. This prolonged absence is difficult to explain. Early humans were opportunistic. They filled every gap they found. Yet these regions remained empty, avoided, as if a memory, nonverbal, instinctual, lingered in the species, warning them away. Even more mysterious is the presence of anomalous fire signatures. In several sites associated with advanced groups, scientists detected burn layers far hotter than normal campfires. The temperatures exceed what early humans were thought capable of producing. Some propose natural wildfires. Others point out that the burn patterns look contained, almost controlled, but with an intensity beyond the known technology of the time. Whatever caused these fires, the advanced groups never returned. The simple ones did, much later, but they brought no memory of the vanished people. Genetic evidence adds its own layer of unease. Certain mitochondrial lineages appear briefly in the archaeological timeline, only to vanish completely. These lineages seem associated with individuals who exhibited traits outside the expected range: greater cranial capacity, unusual metabolic profiles, or signs of advanced manual dexterity. And then, like a candle snuffed out, they disappear. Population modeling shows these lineages did not fade slowly through interbreeding. They ended abruptly, with the clean finality of extinction. Such abrupt disappearances often require large-scale disasters, yet the regions where the collapses occurred show no signs of mass die-offs, no widespread hunger, no long-term population decline. Instead, what we see is precision. The environment shifts just enough to break the advanced groups. The anomalies appear just long enough to erase them. And then the world returns to normal, as if nothing happened. This pattern forced some researchers to ask a dangerous question. What if the reset was not a single event, but a series of smaller ones, timed, targeted, and overwhelmingly effective? If some early humans had begun forming the roots of a cognitively advanced civilization, one that diverged from the rest of the species, its disappearance would have reshaped prehistory completely. Whoever, or whatever, triggered these resets left no monuments, no ruins, no artifacts of power or machinery. Only silence. Silence that feels less like ignorance and more like the shadow of something deliberate. A reset does not simply remove people, it removes potential. It wipes away the future. And as the last pockets of advanced humans vanished, the evolutionary clock did something strange. It slowed across the entire species. Brain expansion stalled. Innovation stalled. Symbolic behavior retreated. Humanity sank into a long, dark plateau, an era of stagnation that lasted far longer than it should have. It was only after this plateau ended that humanity began to rise again. But something was different now. The new rise was slower, more cautious, almost as if the species was advancing through a path already defined and deliberately narrowed. Whatever erased the earlier people left the rest of humanity alive but altered forever. The question that now looms over our origins is haunting. Did humans truly stop evolving on their own, or were we being guided away from a path we were never meant to follow? When humanity emerged from its long evolutionary plateau, something was different. The world was the same, oceans, forests, plains, but human behavior had shifted in ways that defied explanation. Intelligence had not increased dramatically, yet the application of intelligence changed. Instead of leaping forward in bursts of innovation like the lost populations before the reset, early Homo sapiens progressed with unusual caution, almost as if they were navigating the memory of a danger they could not name. This shift is visible in the archaeological record. After the standstill, humans suddenly adopted a pattern of slow, methodical development. Tools improved gradually instead of appearing in sudden evolutionary jumps. Social structures formed slowly, almost hesitantly. Even symbolic behavior, once prone to flashes of mysterious brilliance, now emerged in small, measured steps. It was as if humanity, in its second attempt at advancement, was afraid to move too quickly. Some scientists interpret this as randomness or an artifact of incomplete data. But the more researchers analyze the timeline, the more unnatural the pacing appears. Across multiple continents, Eurasia, Africa, Australia, innovation begins with an eerie synchronization, but at a restrained pace. This new humanity seemed to follow an internal rule: evolve steadily, but never too fast. Progress, but never in leaps. But no known evolutionary mechanism creates this kind of global caution. Something had changed in the human mind. Even more puzzling is the reappearance of behaviors that had existed long before the standstill. Behaviors once seen in those advanced lineages that vanished. Carved ochre returns in Africa. Refined blade technologies reappear in Eurasia. Early signs of structured dwellings show up again thousands of years after similar structures disappeared. It is as though humanity were rediscovering memories instead of inventing them, echoes of knowledge inherited not through culture, but through something deeper. Some anthropologists refer to this phenomenon as cognitive reemergence. Others call it what it feels like: remembering. Yet the memories are faint, incomplete, like a story half erased. Humans remember how to do something, but not why. They rebuild techniques, but not the worldview that originally created them. This suggests that the reset did not erase human potential entirely. It only stripped away the parts that were too advanced. The mystery deepens when examining the earliest signs of long-distance travel after the standstill. Suddenly, humans begin migrating across vast regions they had avoided for tens of thousands of years. They cross deserts once thought too dangerous. They enter mountain ranges in organized groups. They move along shorelines with precision that suggests knowledge of tides and seasons. These expansions were not chaotic wanderings. They were coordinated, as if humanity had regained confidence to re-enter territories abandoned since the disappearance of the advanced groups. But what reawakened that confidence? And why had those territories been forbidden, instinctually or otherwise, for so long? Some geneticists propose that the reset may have altered human populations in a subtle but profound way. After the standstill, all surviving lineages share unusual similarities in neural development, particularly in regions associated with social cohesion and collective behavior. It is as if evolution favored traits that encouraged conformity over divergence, stability over experimentation, memory over innovation. A species once capable of sudden intellectual leaps now advanced as a unified whole, not as scattered bursts of brilliance. The human mind became less prone to extremes, neither too advanced nor too primitive. A stable median, a controlled ascent. If a forgotten civilization once threatened the balance of early humanity, this shift might have been the safeguard that prevented such a divergence from happening again. A species that evolves too quickly risks fracturing into incompatible branches. A species that evolves too slowly risks extinction. But a species whose evolution is moderated, subtly guided along a narrow, predictable path, would be less likely to break apart or surpass its boundaries prematurely. This leads to a chilling possibility. Humanity's restraint after the reset may not be natural. It may be engineered. Perhaps not by machines or deities or external beings, but by the legacy of whatever force orchestrated the first reset. A biological imprint, a psychological scar, a built-in limit to ensure that humanity grows, but never outgrows its place. For tens of thousands of years after the standstill, humans progressed in this controlled manner, unaware that they carried an invisible boundary within their potential. A boundary that shaped their fears, their ambitions, even their memories. If the lost people before the reset touched something forbidden, then the humanity that came after was designed, by nature or by something else, not to repeat that mistake. But boundaries can be crossed again, intentionally or accidentally, and the further we dig into our past, the more it seems that humanity may already have begun approaching that threshold for a second time. As humanity cautiously advanced after the reset, something else began to emerge, something subtle, almost invisible at first. It appeared not in bones or tools, but in patterns of behavior shared across continents. Early humans developed an instinctive aversion to certain types of innovation, as though guided by a quiet, ancestral warning. Technologies that required abstraction or long-term planning emerged slowly. Architectural complexity lagged behind what our cognitive potential should have allowed. Even the earliest attempts at symbolic expression were fragmented, hesitant, as if something inside the human mind resisted crossing a certain boundary again. This resistance shows up most clearly in what archaeologists call innovation gaps, periods where humans had all the necessary skills to evolve rapidly, yet chose not to. The pattern repeats everywhere. Groups capable of producing refined blades reverted to simpler flakes. Communities that experimented with pigments abandoned them for thousands of years. Early attempts at coordinated hunting strategies faded before resurfacing in weaker forms. It was as if humanity had inherited a fear of becoming what it once was. Such psychological imprints are not unheard of in evolution. Species often retain instinctual behaviors formed by ancient catastrophes. But in our case, the instinct does not correspond to a known threat. There is no evidence of a predator, no signs of a disease, no consistent environmental pressure. What humanity feared was not outside. It was within. The strongest evidence of this inherited restraint appears in population modeling. After the standstill, every surviving human lineage displays the same bottleneck, a drastic narrowing of genetic diversity centered around traits linked to risk assessment and social conformity. The traits that once allowed certain groups to leap ahead, creativity, abstract reasoning, cognitive divergence, reappear after the reset, but diluted, softened, smoothed out. Humanity was no longer allowed to fracture into wildly different paths. We had become one species, one direction, one slow and careful ascent. This genetic reshaping coincides with the reorganization of early human societies. In the pre-reset world, communities appear more isolated, more experimental, and more cognitively diverse. After the reset, groups grow in size and cohesion. Individuals begin relying on one another more deeply. Cooperation becomes essential, not optional. Humanity evolves not toward brilliance, but toward unity. Some anthropologists see this as the beginning of culture. Others see it as the aftermath of a purge, an evolutionary course correction. But a third group, still controversial, proposes an even more unsettling interpretation. The idea that humanity's conformity was not the result of natural selection, but the residue of an encounter, a trauma encoded into biological memory. They point to a mysterious phenomenon. Early humans, after the plateau, exhibit a universal pattern of avoidance toward the same types of landscapes where advanced groups once flourished. Certain caves, valleys, and elevated plateaus remain untouched for millennia, despite being fertile and resource-rich. It is as though these places carried an imprint of danger, an unspoken message passed down generations. Stay away. This avoidance lasted long enough that when later groups finally returned, they behaved like newcomers. They rebuilt from scratch with no memory of the ones who came before. But memory is a strange thing in prehistory. What the mind forgets, the body sometimes remembers. Strange carvings appear in regions long untouched, abstract, shapes repeating across continents, seemingly without cultural connection. Spirals, converging lines, figures with elongated heads or branching limbs. Some interpret them as early attempts at symbolic communication. Others see them as echoes, distorted recollections of a lost people, re-emerging in fragmented form. A handful of researchers believe these symbols represent something deeper, a warning humanity once received, one it barely understood, but one that marked us so profoundly that we slowed our own evolution for tens of thousands of years. But warnings fade, instincts weaken, restraints loosen. And as humanity began to gather confidence again, forming stable communities, mastering fire with new precision, expanding across continents, the same cognitive pathways that once led to our first leap began to reopen. For the first time since the reset, humanity was approaching the threshold again. And with each step, prehistoric myths began whispering the same fear across cultures separated by oceans and time. That what came before us might not be gone, only hidden. And that what erased them may still be watching. As humanity approached the threshold again, subtle shifts began to appear in the archaeological record, shifts that echoed the very patterns seen before the reset. Cognitive sparks flared once more. Toolmaking grew more refined, hunting strategies more coordinated, and early humans began altering landscapes in ways unseen since the vanished advanced groups. It was as though the species was awakening from a long sleep, unaware that it was retracing steps once taken by a forgotten people. The first signs of this awakening were not monumental structures or sudden leaps in intelligence, but small changes, quiet but profound. Hearths became more efficient, producing controlled heat. Pigments returned, not as random smears but as deliberate mixtures. The earliest musical instruments appear, suggesting that abstract thinking was stirring again, this time flowing not in sudden bursts but in cautious waves. Something in the human mind was reactivating. Genetic studies reveal that around this period there was a subtle rise in traits associated with creativity, innovation, and spatial reasoning. Not as explosive as the traits seen in the ghost lineages, but unmistakable. These traits did not emerge from nowhere. They were echoes of capacities humanity had once possessed before the reset. Quiet, subdued echoes, but echoes nonetheless. Yet with every cognitive step forward, a shadow followed. In multiple regions, researchers found signs of unexplained disruptions, local collapses that resembled those associated with the lost advanced groups. Settlements abandoned with no sign of conflict. Fire layers hotter than typical campfires. Evidence of sudden migrations, as though entire communities left in fear. The resemblance to pre-reset collapses is undeniable. It was as if the world was reacting again, subtly, gently, like a warning tap on the shoulder. Some researchers believe these disruptions were accidents of nature. Others point out that they align too neatly with periods of accelerated innovation. In certain regions of Africa, as hunting strategies became more complex, droughts intensified inexplicably. In Eurasia, as communities experimented with symbolic markings, sudden cold snaps occurred. In Southeast Asia, as tool-making advanced, coastal flooding struck regions that had been stable for thousands of years. These were not global catastrophes. They were targeted, selective disturbances, just enough to slow progress, not halt it entirely. As humanity persisted, so did these anomalies. This recurring pattern has led a few bold researchers to propose a controversial idea, that Earth's environment may possess a kind of natural feedback loop, a mechanism that reacts when species evolve too quickly. Not consciously, not intentionally, but as part of a deeper balancing force. Perhaps early humanity triggered this mechanism once before, causing the lost lineages to collapse. And now, as humanity began accelerating again, the mechanism stirred once more. But there is another theory, far more unsettling. Some argue that the disturbances are not responses from nature, but residual echoes of whatever force triggered the first reset, something still embedded in the world, still active, still monitoring the pace of human advancement. It may not be an entity, it may not be intelligent. It might simply be a consequence of an older system humanity once encountered, one that shapes evolution from the shadows, subtly guiding it away from certain paths. If such a mechanism exists, it raises a disturbing possibility, that humanity's evolution is not free. That our species grows within boundaries we do not understand, boundaries set long before recorded history. Yet not all regions show disruptions. In a few isolated places, dry plateaus, sheltered valleys, remote coastlines, humans advanced without interference. These pockets became incubators for innovation, the earliest planned shelters, the first long-distance trade routes, the earliest signs of ritual behavior. Some researchers call these zones resistance pockets, places where the influence of the reset mechanism, whatever it may be, was weaker or absent. From these pockets emerged the seeds of the second rise of humanity. The people who lived in these regions carried traits reminiscent of the lost advanced lineages, but stabilized, elevated enough to lead, restrained enough to avoid collapse. They did not leap forward uncontrollably. They ascended steadily, grounded by the collective caution etched into the species. Yet as these groups spread outward, the ancient pattern reappeared. Unnatural deaths, unexplained fires, sudden disappearances. Not enough to erase them, but enough to shape the path they walked. Humanity was advancing again, but so was the shadow that once stopped us. As the second rise of humanity continued, something curious happened. The world began to fill with stories. Long before writing existed, before the first clay tablet or carved glyph, early humans carried myths across continents, myths that should not have had time to spread, yet appear everywhere in strikingly similar forms. Stories of a people who came before, stories of a fall that no one could explain, stories of knowledge that was taken, not lost. These myths persisted like evolutionary memories, woven into the consciousness of cultures that had no direct contact. In distant corners of the world, separated by oceans and tens of thousands of years, humans whispered variations of the same warning. There was an age when people were different. They reached too high, and the world reset itself. For centuries, these stories were dismissed as symbolic metaphors, but modern researchers now recognize them as something else entirely: cultural fossils. Echoes of events so ancient that no artifact remains, yet so profound that the memory endured through myth alone. One of the most compelling of these echoes appears in Central Africa, where oral traditions describe an ancient people whose minds burned too brightly. They mastered things ordinary humans could not understand, only to vanish, leaving nothing but shadows in the stone. In Aboriginal Australia, stories speak of the clever ones, beings who taught early humans skills they were later forced to forget. And in early Eurasian myth, there are tales of a generation closer to the sky, whose disappearance marked the beginning of the world as we know it. These parallels are too consistent to ignore. Anthropologists studying these traditions noticed a pattern. The vanished people were always described as more advanced, not physically stronger, but mentally evolved, more aware, more capable. Their downfall was always sudden, always catastrophic, and always final. It was as though humanity carried a subconscious memory of what came before and what must never be repeated. Archaeology reinforces the mythic echoes. In regions associated with early innovation, pockets of advanced behavior that survived the reset, researchers found sudden shifts in tool-making, ritual practices, and settlement structure. Communities abandoned complex innovations for simpler ones, even when the more advanced methods were clearly superior. It was as if something frightened them into retreating from progress. Fire, once used with remarkable sophistication, suddenly became crude again. Symbolic art, once promising, regressed into randomness. Social structures fractured and reformed repeatedly, as though humans were testing boundaries they could not yet cross. Some scholars suggest these retreats reflect environmental stress or resource scarcity, but the timelines defy such explanations. Retreats often occurred during periods of abundance, not decline. Progress faltered precisely when it should have accelerated. The pattern resembles psychological suppression more than material struggle. This has led some researchers to a radical hypothesis. Humanity may not simply remember the reset through mythology. We may carry it in our genes. Traumatic events, especially those involving survival, can imprint across generations, influencing behavior long after the original cause disappears. If early humans witnessed the collapse of an advanced lineage, the fear it created could have been so overwhelming that it shaped the psychology of the entire species. Such a trauma would not manifest as a single fear, but as a cluster of instincts. Fear of rapid change, fear of sudden innovation, fear of standing out from the group, fear of pushing beyond certain cognitive limits. And indeed, these instincts can be seen in early human behavior after the reset. Progress happened, but always within safe boundaries, always collectively, never in isolated leaps. Those who innovated too quickly often met mysterious ends, sometimes natural, sometimes violent, sometimes inexplicable. But the myths carried one more message, that the force behind the reset, whether natural or something else, did not simply disappear. It receded. It watched. It waited for humanity to stabilize before slowly allowing progress again. This raises an unsettling question. Were the disruptions that followed early innovation simply remnants of a world still healing from the first reset? Or were they signs that the same force, whatever it was, remained active, shaping our evolution from the shadows? If so, humanity's journey after the reset was not only a climb toward civilization, it was a negotiation with an invisible boundary, one that had already been crossed once and punished. And as humanity's pace of advancement began accelerating again, that boundary would soon be tested for a second time. By the time humanity began spreading across Europe, Asia, and the distant edges of Oceania, its second rise was unmistakable. Innovation had returned, not explosively, not in the uncontrollable bursts that characterized the lost lineages, but in a steady, coordinated ascent. And yet, as humans approached new frontiers, intellectually and geographically, the same unsettling patterns that preceded the first reset began to reappear. At the center of this new chapter lies a mystery known to archaeologists as the cognitive gradient. Early humans migrating out of Africa displayed increasing sophistication the farther they traveled. In some regions, symbolic art flourished. In others, long-range planning and complex hunting strategies emerged. But in a handful of rare locations, something more extraordinary happened. Humans began showing signs of a mental leap that did not match the rest of the species. These pockets appeared unexpectedly, small communities whose innovations seemed out of place within their timeline. Stone tools shaped with impossible symmetry, carvings that hinted at abstract cosmology, organized shelters that suggested an understanding of geometry far beyond their era. It felt like déjà vu, the world seeing for a second time the early sparks of a breakthrough. But these sparks were not allowed to grow. Across Europe and Asia, sites associated with these advanced groups show anomalies that mirror the patterns linked to the vanished populations before the first reset. Sudden abandonment, fire levels too intense to be accidental, bones that show rapid development followed by abrupt disappearance. The same story, repeating itself like a warning the world was determined to enforce. Whatever erased the first advanced humans had not disappeared. It had become quieter, subtler, but it was still present. As humanity pushed into colder climates, they began building complex hearths capable of retaining heat for hours. In theory, these hearths should have sparked a technological revolution, but instead, progress stalled again. Hearth design regressed, becoming simpler. Groups that once produced advanced tools reverted to crude flakes. Symbolic carvings were abandoned mid-development and never resumed. Archaeologists long assumed these regressions were the result of harsh environments, but new data contradict that explanation. Many of these regions were resource-rich, easily habitable, and stable for thousands of years. The decline was not ecological. It was cognitive. It was as if the same instinct that once halted humanity after the reset was resurfacing, an inherited fear of advancing too quickly. Meanwhile, another anomaly emerged, one far more enigmatic. Across Eurasia, researchers found isolated skulls displaying subtle differences in cranial shape, particularly in regions associated with abstract reasoning and visual processing. These individuals appear suddenly and vanish just as quickly, leaving no descendants. Some call them outliers. Others call them echoes of the first people. Their presence raises an uncomfortable possibility. The genetic remnants of the lost advanced humans may have resurfaced, briefly, only to be suppressed again. This suppression did not come from violence or collapse. It came from invisibility. These outliers left no cultural legacy, no technological influence, no impact on the broader human trajectory. They appear like sparks in the dark, bright for a moment, fading before they could ignite anything around them. Some researchers argue this pattern points to a biological mechanism, an innate tendency for the species to eliminate extremes, maintaining cognitive equilibrium. But the precision is too uncanny. Why would evolution snuff out the very traits that once led to innovation? Why would it erase the individuals most capable of accelerating progress? Unless, of course, these extreme traits represented a path humanity was not meant to walk again. Evidence from Siberia deepens the mystery. Carved stones arranged in non-random alignments suggest an early understanding of astronomical cycles. These structures predate similar monuments by tens of thousands of years, and yet, days after their creators built them, the settlement was abandoned. Bones found nearby show no signs of struggle or famine. The people simply left. What frightened them? What drove them away from the very innovations they created? Some anthropologists believe these early groups sensed something, an echo of the force behind the first reset, a tension or presence woven into the fabric of nature itself. Not a creature, not a deity, something older, something built into the world, a boundary. And whenever humanity approached that boundary, the world reminded them, gently at first, then with increasing clarity, that they were to turn back. But humans are persistent, and as their numbers grew, so did their confidence. Eventually, humanity would cross that boundary again, not by accident, but by choice. And when they did, the ancient pattern would resurface with frightening precision. Humanity was rising. The shadow was rising with it. As humanity continued its expansion across continents, the subtle tension between progress and restraint grew more pronounced. Humans were becoming more capable, developing language, forming complex social bonds, experimenting with symbolic behavior. But each time they approached a breakthrough reminiscent of the lost lineages, something disrupted the pattern. Progress surged forward, only to recoil. Awareness deepened, only to dim. Curiosity ignited, only to quiet itself again. It was as though early humans sensed an invisible ceiling above them, one they dared not push too hard. This ceiling becomes most apparent in the development of symbolic art. In dozens of regions, early humans produced astonishing bursts of creativity, hand stencils, geometric patterns, enigmatic figurines, then abruptly stopped. For thousands of years afterward, nothing comparable appears. These pauses do not align with changes in climate or population density. They align with acceleration, always emerging immediately after a period of cognitive growth. The pattern is unmistakable. Each time humanity grew too quickly, an unseen force pushed back. In northern Africa, a group known as the Outliers developed sophisticated hunting tools far earlier than neighboring populations. Their craftsmanship suggested planning, foresight, and an understanding of abstract shapes. Yet shortly after this surge, the Outliers vanished from several regions. Not gradually, suddenly. Their cultural markers disappear, replaced by simpler technologies. What caused their disappearance? No signs of warfare, no climate catastrophe, no migrations large enough to erase them. It is the same story seen in the ancient Levant, in prehistoric China, in early Europe. A spark, then silence. A rise, then retreat. As though humanity was being shaped, not by physical environments, but by limits etched into the world itself. Geneticists observing this period noticed another subtle anomaly. Populations that displayed early signs of advanced cognition often exhibit sudden genetic contraction, bottlenecks too rapid and too localized to be explained by natural selection. These bottlenecks consistently remove traits associated with high cognitive divergence, leaving behind more stabilized, moderate variants. This is not the behavior of evolution drifting randomly. It looks like evolution being corrected. Yet humanity continued its advance, driven by something deeper than memory, an instinct to explore. As humans migrated into Europe, they encountered new challenges: colder climates, dangerous megafauna, vast forests. These pressures should have slowed progress, but instead, they sharpened it. Humans began coordinating hunts on a scale unseen before. They crafted complex clothing to survive the cold. Their shelters grew more elaborate. And once again, the world responded. In multiple sites across Ice Age Europe, archaeologists found evidence of sudden cold snaps that lasted far shorter than typical glacial cycles. These cold snaps occurred precisely when humans reached new levels of innovation. Shelters were abandoned swiftly. Occupation layers thin out. Populations dispersed. It was as if the environment itself shifted whenever humans advanced too quickly, as though the boundaries of evolution were not physical but adaptive, adjusting to keep the species on a controlled path. But if the world was correcting humanity, the corrections were not perfect. Some regions, hidden valleys, isolated plateaus, deep caves, seem untouched by these disruptions. These became, once again, the incubators of innovation. In one such site in Central Europe, researchers found early musical instruments, bone flutes carved with precision far beyond what typical cognitive models predict. The creators of these instruments lived only a few generations before disappearing. Their tools, art, and rituals appear abruptly and vanish just as quickly, leaving no descendants. The pattern repeats across continents. Advanced behavior appears, the group disappears. Others avoid the territory. Innovation resets to a lower baseline. It is a cycle so consistent it begins to resemble a mechanism. But no mechanism, natural or otherwise, can erase every trace. And in the darkest corners of caves, far from the surface disruptions, early humans left behind something unexpected. Marks that do not match the rest of their culture. Spirals, branching lines, strange humanoid shapes with elongated forms. These images do not appear in ordinary habitation layers. They appear deep underground, in spaces associated with ritual, fear, and initiation. Some researchers believe these markings record hallucinations or dreams. Others believe they depict ancient warnings, visions of what came before or what humanity feared would return. A few, more daring, propose that these shapes represent the lost advanced people themselves, or even the force that erased them, a force not understood, not named, but remembered in the only way early humans could record it. In the dark, with shaking hands, miles inside the earth. Whatever these images show, they carried an unmistakable message. Do not ascend too quickly. Do not repeat the old mistake. Yet despite this ancient warning carved in stone, humanity's rise continued. With each step forward, the boundary grew thinner, and soon humanity would cross it again. This time, not in scattered pockets, but as a species. As humanity stepped into the Upper Paleolithic, the period many archaeologists call the true dawn of modern humans, something extraordinary happened. For the first time since the reset, Innovation surged not in isolated pockets, but across continents. It was as if a switch had been thrown deep within the human mind. Art, architecture, long-distance trade, ritual, music, all began to flourish. The spark that once appeared only in brief, doomed flashes now ignited in millions. This synchronized awakening is one of the greatest mysteries in human history. How did scattered populations, separated by vast landscapes and with no contact between them, suddenly begin producing symbolic art, complex tools, and new forms of social behavior at nearly the same time? Evolution does not synchronize across continents, not naturally. The timeline suggests something subtle shifted inside the species, something that allowed suppressed abilities to re-emerge, not explosively as before, but with stability. This was not a rupture in the evolutionary boundary, but a controlled crossing. In caves across Europe, humans began painting with breathtaking precision, shading, perspective, depth, techniques that would not reappear in the historical record until tens of thousands of years later. These were not primitive scratches. They were masterpieces, and they appeared suddenly, fully formed. Meanwhile, in Africa, complex beadwork and symbolic burials emerged. In Siberia, humans carved the first intricate figurines. In Australia, vast rock art galleries appeared, spanning entire cliffs. This explosion of creativity was global, impossibly global. Archaeologists call this event the Great Leap Forward, but a more fitting name may be the Second Awakening. Yet even in this age of rapid progress, the old boundary showed signs of returning. Innovation surged, then plateaued. Art blossomed, then stagnated. Groups developed new technologies, only to abandon them inexplicably. The push and pull of progress and restraint continued, but now on a species-wide scale. One of the most haunting clues from this era lies in the sudden appearance of large, complex gatherings, ritual sites where thousands of people met despite living in small, scattered groups. These gatherings defy easy explanation. Why would early humans risk long journeys to meet strangers? What compelled them to gather at the same geographic points year after year? Some researchers propose that these gatherings were not celebrations, but responses, attempts to make sense of a recurring force that shaped their evolution. Perhaps humanity sensed it again, faintly, like a pressure at the edge of awareness. Perhaps these gatherings were the first organized attempts to confront the boundary that had shaped them for millennia. Supporting this theory are the enigmatic ritual structures found at several of these sites: stone circles, buried posts, geometric layouts carved into the earth. They are older than agriculture, older than cities, older than the concept of civilization itself, and many of them align with astronomical events, as though early humans believed that whatever shaped their destiny was connected to the sky. Which introduces a disturbing possibility. What if the reset was not a local event, but a planetary one? Some scholars believe the lost advanced lineage may have harnessed forms of knowledge, mathematical, astronomical, or perhaps symbolic, that connected them to patterns greater than their environment. Knowledge that triggered the first reset. Knowledge that early humans, tens of thousands of years later, were cautiously rediscovering. If so, the Great Leap Forward was not simply a burst of creativity, it was a breach. Humanity had crossed the boundary again, and almost immediately, the world reacted. Cold snaps struck Eurasia. Megafauna populations began collapsing in strange, localized ways. Vast regions became unstable, forcing migrations that reshaped the global population. The synchrony of these disruptions mirrors the pattern seen during earlier evolutionary flashes, but scaled up massively. This suggests an unsettling conclusion. The force that shaped the first reset still existed, but humanity had become too widespread, too numerous, too connected for it to extinguish the species again. Instead, it pushed back in fragments, ecological shocks, climatic anomalies, subtle genetic pressures. But this time, humanity did not retreat. The boundary bent. It did not break. Human progress continued, slowly, cautiously, but unstoppable. And as humans spread across the earth, they carried with them the faint memory of a force older than their species, a boundary they had crossed once too quickly, and were now crossing again. What happened next would determine whether humanity would ascend beyond its limits or repeat the fate of the lost civilization. As the Great Leap Forward spread across continents, humanity evolved into something the world had never seen before. A species aware of its own potential. Art flourished, tools refined, rituals deepened, and communities grew. Yet beneath this rising wave of creativity, the ancient tension persisted, a quiet, invisible pull that slowed humanity each time it neared a certain threshold. What makes this era so perplexing is not the innovations themselves, but how unevenly they unfolded. Some groups produced astonishing breakthroughs, harpoons with aerodynamic precision, pigments blended into sophisticated palettes, intricate figurines carved from mammoth ivory, while neighboring groups remained almost unchanged. But the most enigmatic pattern was this. Every time a group advanced too quickly, it collapsed. Not always catastrophically, sometimes subtly, sometimes silently. In several regions of Eurasia, archaeologists discovered settlements abruptly abandoned during periods of intense creative growth. People who lived comfortably for generations suddenly walked away, leaving tools, ornaments, and even food behind. There were no signs of violence, no mass graves, no environmental triggers. They simply vanished. Their disappearance mirrors that of the lost advanced lineages from before the reset, but on a smaller scale, as if the force that once erased an entire branch of humanity now pushed back with less intensity, unable to repeat its earlier purge on a global scale. One particularly haunting site in France, dating to nearly 35,000 years ago, contains a cave filled with magnificent paintings. Lions, rhinoceros, bears, human-animal hybrids. Art so refined it defies evolutionary expectations. Yet shortly after the flourishing of this symbolic world, the artists vanished. The cave was sealed naturally for millennia, untouched until rediscovered in modern times. Why did its creators disappear? Why did their descendants not return? Why does the same rise and silence pattern echo across continents? Some anthropologists believe these collapses represent natural cultural turnover, but the timing argues otherwise. Innovation peaks, then the group vanishes. Another group rises, then stalls. The rhythm is too consistent, too cyclical, as if humanity was advancing inside a corridor with invisible walls. Those walls appear again in genetic data. Around 40,000 years ago, humans interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans, absorbing fragments of ancient diversity. But shortly after these interbreeding events, certain gene variants associated with creativity, risk-taking, and cognitive divergence diminish sharply in frequency. It is as if something, environmental or otherwise, filtered out the most extreme expressions of human potential. This filtering coincides with mysterious burn layers found across multiple prehistoric sites. Fires so intense they altered cave ceilings into glassy crusts. Fires hotter than necessary for warmth or cooking. Fires that seem to have erupted during periods of rapid cognitive expansion. Some researchers suggest natural wildfires. Others argue they were ritual burnings, symbolic attempts to cleanse or contain something. But a few whisper a more unsettling thought. These fires may be shadows of the same force that once ended the first advanced humanity, a force that, now weakened or diffused, manifests only as environmental disturbances. Whatever the cause, the effect was clear. Innovation slowed, populations stabilized, and humanity continued along a steady, almost managed trajectory. Yet even in this constrained ascent, something extraordinary happened. Humans began forming long-distance networks. Beads from Africa appear in the Middle East. Ochre from caves in Europe is traced to quarries hundreds of miles away. These networks represent the first global exchange system, primitive but real. Ideas were spreading faster than genetics, creating a shared cognitive world. And with shared cognition came shared memory. Similar symbols appear in caves separated by oceans. Similar myths arise in cultures that never met. Similar fears are recorded in underground chambers, etched into stone with trembling lines. Spirals, eyes, branching forms, towering shapes looming over tiny humans. What were these ancient people remembering? Something real? Something imagined? Or something their ancestors once witnessed during the first reset? Some researchers believe these symbols are humanity's oldest warning signs, messages from a time before writing, when the only way to preserve memory was to carve it into stone. The warnings are vague, fragmented, cryptic, like dreams fading upon waking, but the message seems consistent. Do not advance too quickly. Do not awaken what sleeps beneath the world. Yet the very existence of such warnings reveals a paradox. Humanity was advancing anyway. The boundary was weakening, the species was growing, and the ancient force, whatever it had been, could no longer stop humanity as it once had. The stage was set for a dramatic shift. Something new was emerging, something the world had not seen since the lost civilization vanished. Humanity was on the brink of its next great transformation, and this time, nothing would be able to stop it. As humanity pushed toward its next transformation, the world began to shift in ways both subtle and immense. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Coastlines rose and fell. The climate, once relatively stable, entered a period of dramatic oscillation. To most archaeologists, these changes were part of the natural rhythm of Earth, but viewed through the lens of human evolution, they reveal a pattern that is far more intentional in shape. Each major climatic pulse aligns with moments when human cognition surged. Not before, not after, but during. It is as if the world itself responded to human advancement, sometimes nurturing it, sometimes suppressing it, always shaping its direction. One such pulse occurred around 25,000 years ago. Humans were thriving, creating elaborate clothing, building structures that defied their environment, forming vast social networks. Some groups even developed proto-architectural designs, complex mammoth bone dwellings arranged with geometric precision. And then, almost immediately, a cold wave swept across Eurasia. It was not a slow cooling, it was abrupt, too abrupt. Temperatures plummeted, forests collapsed, entire ecosystems shifted in a matter of centuries, far faster than typical glacial cycles. Many advanced communities vanished, their innovations frozen in time. Yet simpler, more conservative groups survived. The pattern is unmistakable. Those who advanced too quickly were the ones most vulnerable to the environmental shock. This selective disruption echoes the earlier collapses of the lost advanced lineages. It was as though evolution was being pruned, branches removed when they stretched too far beyond the trunk. But unlike the first reset, this wave did not wipe out the species. Humanity had become too numerous, too widespread, too resilient. The pruning was no longer a purge. It became pressure, persistent, guiding, almost mechanical. During this period, another mystery emerged: the sudden rise of monumental structures across multiple continents. In Siberia, puzzling stone alignments appeared. In the Levant, massive communal structures rose from the landscape, far older than agriculture. In parts of Africa, ritual sites expanded dramatically as though responding to a shared signal. These structures share certain features: alignment with solstices or lunar cycles, deliberate orientation toward cardinal directions, symbolic motifs hinting at cosmological awareness. But the greatest puzzle is their timing. They appear after each environmental disruption, as though humans were rebuilding society in ways that reflected a deeper understanding, perhaps even a fear of the forces shaping their world. Some researchers argue that these monuments were early attempts to control or predict the environment. Others believe they were ritual sites built to appease whatever ancient memory haunted humanity, a memory of the first reset. The most enigmatic of these sites is a vast stone enclosure found in the Near East, tens of thousands of years older than cities or agriculture. Its pillars depict strange hybrid creatures, part human, part animal, part abstract geometry. These images do not reflect daily life. They reflect something older, something remembered. The people who built these monuments were hunter-gatherers. They should not have possessed the organizational structure to create such architecture, and yet they did. Their construction marks a turning point, a moment when humanity began resisting the ancient boundary rather than retreating from it. But with resistance came danger. Shortly after these structures appeared, new anomalies echoed across the prehistoric world: localized collapses, sudden droughts, unexplained migrations. It was as if the same ancient force, dormant for millennia, stirred again in response to humanity's growing awareness. A theory emerged among a small group of scholars. Perhaps the lost advanced civilization had reached a similar point, recognizing the hidden forces that shaped their evolution, attempting to rise beyond them, and paying the ultimate price. If so, the monumental structures of the Upper Paleolithic may not represent the birth of civilization. They may represent a warning, a reminder of what happened once before and what could happen again. Yet despite every disruption, every collapse, every boundary, humanity continued its ascent. The species had become more adaptive, more unified, more resilient than ever before. For the first time in tens of thousands of years, humans were approaching a threshold that even the lost people had not crossed: the threshold of true civilization. And the shadow that once erased the first advanced lineage would soon be confronted again, this time by millions, not a scattered few. As humanity drew closer to the birth of true civilization, the ancient patterns that had shaped its evolution began to intensify. The boundary that once halted progress now seemed thinner, more fragile, strained by a species that refused to stop advancing. Humans were no longer scattered bands following instinct alone. They were becoming architects of meaning, builders of memory, and slowly, inevitably, challengers of the force that once erased their predecessors. The most telling evidence of this shift is the growing presence of symbols, not isolated marks or decorative motifs, but cohesive systems of meaning. In cave systems spanning from France to Indonesia, researchers found the same mysterious shapes: converging lines, three-pronged forms, spirals, and grid-like patterns. These symbols appear suddenly, persist for millennia, and then evolve into more complex expressions. They are too consistent to be coincidence, too widespread to be local invention, too persistent to be random decoration. Some archaeologists argue these shapes represent the earliest attempts at communication across generations, proto-writing, a precursor to future scripts. But others see something deeper: shared memory resurfacing, fragments of knowledge that belonged not to this humanity but to the one erased long ago. A controversial hypothesis suggests that these symbols are echoes, residual cognitive structures encoded in the species after the reset. If the lost civilization once used symbolic communication, traces of that system might linger in the human mind, re-emerging as soon as the species crossed a certain cognitive threshold. If true, it means humanity's second rise was not entirely new. It was a remembering. Yet remembering was dangerous. As symbolic systems expanded, so too did the ancient pattern of disruption. Unexplained collapses struck regions undergoing rapid cognitive development. Groups experimenting with new social structures fractured abruptly. Settlements with early architecture experienced sudden abandonment. One of the most haunting examples lies in the vast limestone caverns of Europe. Deep within the darkness, researchers found chambers covered in handprints, hundreds of them. But these prints are not simple signatures. Many appear distorted, elongated, or placed in unnatural angles. Some scholars interpret them as attempts to depict altered states of consciousness. Others propose they represent encounters with something unseen, visions inherited from ancestors who lived through the first reset. And then there are the geometric carvings, patterns so precise they defy the expected capabilities of hunter-gatherers. In one chamber, a series of parallel lines carved millimeters apart creates an optical effect resembling vibration or movement. When illuminated by flickering torchlight, the carving appears to ripple, a phenomenon modern researchers confirm was intentional. The artist knew exactly how light behaved in darkness. Who taught them this? How did they learn such precision without mathematics? Or did they inherit the remnants of a knowledge system once possessed by the erased people? The deeper one goes into these ancient caves, the clearer the message becomes. Humanity was climbing the same staircase the lost civilization once ascended. Outside the caves, another breakthrough arrived: specialization. For the first time, not every member of a group performed the same tasks. Some became toolmakers, others ritual leaders, others hunters or gatherers. Specialization is one of the hallmarks of true civilization, and once it emerges, progress accelerates. But accelerated progress invited a familiar response. Around 20,000 years ago, massive disruptions struck the globe. Some regions suffered intense drought, others experienced floods of unprecedented scale. Glacial pulses shifted coastlines rapidly. Human populations contracted sharply in certain areas, always the same areas displaying rapid innovation. Coincidence? Or the ancient mechanism exerting pressure again? Some scientists argue that these climatic events were natural, but the synchronicity remains unnerving. Cognitive leaps followed by targeted disruptions, just as before the reset. Yet something had changed. Unlike the lost people, humanity no longer collapsed. It bent. It suffered, but it did not break. Why? Because this time, humans were connected. Networks of trade, shared myths, and symbolic communication created resilience where none existed before. The species no longer relied on isolated pockets of brilliance. It advanced as a collective, distributing innovation across millions rather than concentrating it in a few vulnerable groups. For the first time in prehistory, the ancient force, whether natural, environmental, or something older, could not suppress humanity entirely. The boundary had been reached. The boundary had been tested. And now, the boundary was weakening. Humanity was approaching the greatest transformation since the reset: the birth of agriculture and the first true civilizations. What happened next would either fulfill the destiny of the erased people or awaken the force that once destroyed them. As the Ice Age waned and global temperatures rose, humanity entered the most decisive turning point since the reset. The world softened. Glaciers retreated, rivers expanded, and fertile plains emerged from beneath the melting ice. To most species, this shift was merely environmental. To humans, it was an invitation, a doorway, a moment when something dormant inside the species began to stir again. It is during this period that one of the greatest mysteries in human evolution emerges: agriculture. The sudden rise of farming, livestock domestication, and sedentary life is one of the most abrupt transformations in history. For nearly 200,000 years, humans lived as hunter-gatherers, adaptive, mobile, cautious. Then, in scattered regions across the world, different groups began doing something unprecedented. They stopped wandering. They settled. They planted. They built. Why here? Why now? Why everywhere at once? The traditional explanation is simple. Climate change created abundance, allowing humans to experiment. But the archaeological record tells a more perplexing story. Agriculture appears almost simultaneously in regions with vastly different environments. The Levant, the Yangtze Basin, Mesoamerica, the Andes, the Nile Valley. Each developed farming independently, yet in sync, as though guided by an unseen rhythm. It was the same global synchrony seen during the Great Leap Forward. Once again, humanity crossed a cognitive threshold collectively, not randomly. Once again, we moved toward a way of life the reset had previously forbidden. And once again, the world responded. Shortly after agriculture's emergence, dramatic environmental anomalies appear. Sudden floods, abrupt droughts, localized cooling events, rapid desertification in key early farming zones. These disruptions were not global. They targeted the same regions where human innovation surged the fastest. In some cases, early farming communities collapsed entirely. Villages were abandoned, fields left untended, structures swallowed by shifting soil. The pattern mirrors the pruning mechanism seen throughout prehistory: progress followed by pressure. But this time, something was different. Humanity did not retreat. It adapted. Some groups abandoned farming temporarily, returning to foraging. Others moved deeper into valleys or climbed into hillsides. Some communities developed new techniques: irrigation, seed selection, storage pits, that turned environmental instability into opportunity. Agriculture did not die. It evolved. Researchers now recognize that these early pressures may have accelerated innovation rather than halted it. Each disruption forced humans to refine their methods, organize more efficiently, and cooperate more broadly. The ancient mechanism that once erased the lost advanced lineage could no longer reset humanity. It could only shape us. But as villages became permanent, another mystery emerged, one that archaeologists still struggle to explain. Monumental architecture appeared before cities, before writing, even before large populations. Hunter-gatherers, people without pottery, without metal, without domesticated animals, began constructing massive ritual structures. Stone pillars weighing tons were arranged with precision. Circular enclosures aligned to the stars rose from the earth. Some sites appear designed for ceremonies we still cannot decipher. The question that haunts researchers is simple. Why did the world's earliest monuments appear before the world's earliest civilizations? It is as though humans remembered, on some instinctual level, that the path to the next stage of evolution required more than survival. It required meaning, a shared cosmology, a connection to forces older than humanity itself. These ancient structures resemble the symbolic patterns from the Upper Paleolithic, but scaled up, expanded from cave walls into landscapes. They look less like inventions and more like recreations, echoes of something humanity once knew. And with every new monument, the species stepped closer to the path the lost civilization may have walked, the path toward knowledge that once triggered the reset. If agriculture was the foundation, monuments were the signal, markers announcing that humanity had crossed the boundary again, and the world trembled in response. Droughts intensified, animal populations shifted, disease patterns changed. Yet humans endured, protected not by strength, but by the resilience built through tens of thousands of years of suppressed evolution. Now, with the world reshaping around them, early humans were poised to create something unprecedented, a structure that neither nature nor the ancient mechanism could stop. The first sustained civilizations. But the question lingered like a shadow over every fertile valley and every rising settlement. Would civilization trigger the same fate as the lost people? Or had humanity finally grown beyond the reach of the reset? As early farming villages expanded into stable communities, something unprecedented began to occur. Humans started shaping the environment with intention. They redirected rivers, carved terraces into hillsides, cleared forests to create fields. For the first time, humans were no longer merely adapting to nature. They were altering it. This reversal of the ancient relationship between humanity and the world marked a profound shift, one that seemed to challenge the invisible boundaries that had restrained the species for millennia. Across the Fertile Crescent, small settlements began clustering together, forming networks of trade, ritual, and cooperation. We see the first evidence of planned architecture, rectangular houses replacing circular huts, communal structures rising from the ground, storage facilities organized with surprising sophistication. These were not random experiments. They were steps towards something larger, something humanity had never achieved before. But with this rise came new mysteries. Certain settlements show sudden expansions, far larger than population growth alone can explain. Others appear to have formed almost overnight, as though multiple groups converged in a single place for reasons beyond survival. Archaeologists find no signs of conquest, no evidence of forced migration. It is as if early humans were being pulled, drawn to specific points on the landscape. The same points where prehistoric monuments had once stood. The same points aligned with celestial events. The same points remembered in myth. Something about these locations mattered, something ancient. Even more puzzling is the sudden appearance of standardized building techniques. Across regions separated by hundreds of miles, early communities began shaping stone in similar ways, organizing homes in similar layouts, dividing labor with similar structures. Cultural diffusion cannot explain the speed or synchronicity. It resembles a dormant blueprint resurfacing, one imprinted so deeply into the human species after the reset that it re-emerged the moment conditions allowed it. But as communities grew, they became vulnerable. Diseases spread, crops failed, rivalries formed, and just as before, the world responded. Around 9,000 years ago, multiple early settlements experienced abrupt collapses. Entire villages were burned, not by enemies or invaders, but seemingly by their own inhabitants. Layers of ash reveal controlled destruction, structures dismantled carefully, then set aflame with precision. Some researchers interpret these burnings as rituals. Others believe they were resets, attempts by humans to purge something they feared was emerging again. What exactly were they afraid of? At several sites, beneath the layers of ash, archaeologists found something unexpected. Carvings and symbols buried under the floors, intentionally hidden. Many resemble the geometric motifs found deep in Paleolithic caves, spirals intersecting with animal forms, abstract shapes implying duality, tension, thresholds. They are older than the settlements themselves, suggesting they were carried from earlier traditions, perhaps memories of the lost civilization, preserved through symbols long after the story had been forgotten. It becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss these patterns as coincidence. Humanity was not just building structures, it was reactivating ideas, reawakening memories, repeating a path once walked by those who vanished. And as this path unfolded, the scale of human ambition expanded. Communities began controlling their food sources more efficiently, domesticating animals, manipulating crops. The first signs of astronomical awareness appear in alignments of structures and ceremonial spaces. Humans were no longer simply surviving. They were anticipating, planning, observing the heavens with intent. This was the threshold the lost people may have crossed, the point where knowledge becomes power, and power becomes danger. Right as this awareness blossomed, the ancient disruption struck again. Climate anomalies destabilized farming belts. Rivers shifted disastrously. Fertile lands turned barren, yet unlike before, humanity persisted. The species had grown too many roots, formed too many connections, adapted in too many ways to be erased again. Where one settlement fell, another survived. Where one valley dried, another flourished. The ancient force, whether environmental or something older, could shape humanity, but it could no longer stop us. And then came the most extraordinary development of all. Some settlements recovered and grew even larger. Others rose in entirely new locations, surpassing their predecessors. By 7,000 years ago, humanity achieved something unmatched in its entire evolutionary history. Large-scale, continuously occupied proto-cities. The boundary that once defined the limit of human potential had been crossed, not in a sudden surge that invited erasure, but in a slow, coordinated ascent that no longer threatened the balance of the world. Civilization had begun. But civilization would demand a price. Because with every stone lifted, every field tilled, every star charted, humanity stepped deeper into territory once forbidden, territory that the lost advanced people had entered before being erased. And as the first proto-cities rose from the earth, a quiet question began to echo through prehistory. If humanity had finally surpassed the old boundary, what would awaken on the other side? As the first proto-cities emerged, humanity stepped into an era unlike anything that had come before. The world's scattered tribes, once shaped by instinct and survival alone, were now constructing permanent settlements, densely populated, intricately organized, and guided by something deeper than necessity. A new kind of mind was awakening, a mind capable not only of creating, but of planning centuries into the future. And with this awakening came a profound shift. For the first time since the reset, humans no longer moved through the world cautiously. They moved with purpose. They built granaries that stored entire seasons of food. They erected walls that defined collective identity. They crafted tools not merely for survival, but for transformation. Everything about early civilization radiated intention, as though humanity had finally regained the confidence it lost tens of thousands of years earlier. Yet the rise of cities brought with it a new kind of pressure, one that mirrored the ancient force that once shaped humanity. A pressure not from nature, but from humanity itself. Population density reshaped cognition. Collective labor reshaped society. Hierarchies emerged: leaders, priests, architects, artisans. Specialization deepened. And the moment humans began organizing into structured societies, innovation surged in a pattern so accelerated it rivaled the lost lineages' evolution. In some regions, humans began tracking the movement of celestial bodies with astonishing precision. They aligned temples with solstices, plotted lunar cycles, and designed ceremonial spaces corresponding to the heavens. Thousands of years before telescopes, humans calculated the rhythms of the sky with mysterious accuracy. The question is not how they learned to do this, but why they felt compelled to. Some researchers argue that these practices emerged from agricultural necessity. Others believe they reflect humanity's attempt to understand the forces that once controlled its evolution. But a third possibility lingers, one that scholars rarely voice aloud, that early humans sensed, perhaps instinctually, that the boundary which shaped their ancestors was connected to the sky, not as a place of gods or myths, but as a realm governing the patterns of time and change. If the lost civilization once glimpsed this connection before being erased, then early cities may represent humanity's second attempt to decipher the architecture of reality itself. The archaeological record shows something unsettling. As soon as humans began organizing into urban societies, disruptive events intensified. Floods swept through valleys. Earthquakes shattered settlements. Plague-like diseases appeared abruptly in overcrowded centers. These events were not random. They aligned eerily with the rapid rise of complex social structures. Yet again, humanity persisted. Unlike the lost people, humans now had scale, cooperation, memory. They rebuilt faster than collapse could.
Spread. Every failure became a lesson. Every disaster became a catalyst for innovation.
Irrigation systems appeared where floods once destroyed crops. Mud brick architecture emerged to replace fragile shelters. Trade networks expanded, connecting distant cultures into webs of resilience. Humanity was no longer a collection of vulnerable sparks. It was a wildfire. And as civilization stabilized, something extraordinary happened. Writing. The ability to store knowledge outside the mind, to preserve memory across generations, to escape the amnesia that once doomed the advanced lineages. With writing, humanity became immune to the erasures of the past. Even if cities fell, their knowledge could be rebuilt. Even if disasters struck, their insights could survive. Writing was humanity's first true defiance of the boundary. And almost immediately after writing emerged, so did myth. The earliest written stories across Sumer, Egypt, India, and the Mediterranean all describe the same event. A catastrophic fall of an earlier age, a world destroyed because its inhabitants became too great, reached too high, or angered the forces that shaped creation. These myths do not describe a future apocalypse. They describe a memory of the reset. But civilization did not heed the warning. It could not. The momentum was too strong. The species had evolved beyond the point of inhibition. Humanity now walked a path that led inevitably toward increasing complexity: mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, engineering. The very things that once triggered the downfall of the lost people. And for the first time in tens of thousands of years, the ancient force faced something unprecedented. A species it could no longer reset. Humanity had outgrown the mechanism. The boundary had been crossed permanently. But the question lingered like a shadow stretching across the cradle of civilization. If the reset could no longer erase humanity, what consequences would follow as humans reclaimed the knowledge that once destroyed their forgotten predecessors? As civilizations multiplied across the ancient world, humanity entered an era the lost lineage never reached, an era in which knowledge no longer lived inside individuals, but in systems, etched into clay, carved into stone, whispered through rituals, preserved in libraries, guarded by priesthoods. The old vulnerabilities vanished. A drought could kill a harvest, but not the idea of agriculture. A flood could swallow a city, but not the blueprint of how to rebuild it. The ancient mechanism, whatever it had been, could weaken human bodies, but not the written word. For the first time since the reset, humanity became truly unstoppable. Yet with that momentum came an eerie silence. The strange disruptions that once mirrored humanity's cognitive surges began to fade. The abrupt collapses became rarer, more scattered, less synchronized. The world no longer pushed back when humans advanced. And in that quiet, something unsettling emerged. Civilizations thousands of miles apart began producing myths that resembled each other with haunting precision. They all spoke of a time before, when beings closer to the sky possessed knowledge that humans later lost. They all spoke of a catastrophic fall. They all spoke of a reset. But most chilling were the warnings embedded within these myths, warnings that humanity, in its rise, was nearing the same threshold that destroyed the first advanced people. Warnings that knowledge itself carried a danger, that there were forces in the world older than cities, older than language, older than memory, that reacted when humans crossed certain lines. Ancient texts describe this danger with different names: the divine boundary, the forbidden ascent, the limit of fire, the curve of heaven. Always different, always the same. A reminder of the forgotten people humanity replaced. In Mesopotamia, scribes wrote of kings whose reigns stretched thousands of years before the flood, as though they belonged to a different species. In Egypt, priests recorded that the gods once walked among humans, guiding them until a great collapse forced them to retreat. In India, legends describe cycles of humanity rising and falling, each time reaching further before being destroyed. These are not rustic tales. They are memories, distorted but persistent. What makes these stories so compelling is not their imagery, but their timing. They all appear right as urban civilizations reach their first apex, as mathematics sharpens, as astronomy becomes precise, as writing becomes complex. It was as if humanity, by surpassing the cognitive threshold, suddenly remembered what came before, not through fossils, not through archaeology, but through something older than both: inherited memory. But instead of turning back, humanity accelerated. As cities became empires, humanity repeated, on a grand scale, patterns that once belonged to the erased lineage: the construction of monumental structures aligned to celestial cycles, the pursuit of abstract mathematics, an obsession with mapping the heavens, the belief that the universe had rules humans could discover. With each step, the species moved closer to the same precipice the lost advanced people once approached. But this time, the world did not reset, because the mechanism that once enforced the boundary no longer worked on a globalized species. Humanity had spread too far, grown too numerous, diversified too richly. A purge would not erase knowledge now, it would only scatter it, ensuring its survival. And so the world adapted. It no longer shaped humanity through extinction, it shaped us through complexity, through unpredictability, through entropy and challenge. Instead of crushing humanity, it tested us. Civilizations rose and fell, but knowledge accumulated. Empires collapsed, but the written word endured. The ancient warnings echoed across cultures, but humanity pushed past them anyway, driven by an instinct older than caution, the instinct to evolve. And here lies the final truth, the one hidden in the long silence between our evolutionary leaps. Humanity did not stop evolving. Humanity was stopped. Stopped by forces we no longer remember. Stopped by mechanisms that once protected the balance of life. Stopped because an earlier version of our species reached too high, too fast. But once the world could no longer halt us, the path that was once forbidden became inevitable. Biological evolution slowed, but cultural evolution exploded. Technology replaced mutation, knowledge replaced instinct, creativity replaced adaptation. We became a species that evolves through ideas instead of genes. And now, thousands of years after the lost civilization was erased, humans stand once again at the threshold they once crossed, a threshold defined not by stone tools or symbolic art, but by power, technology, and the ability to reshape the world itself. The question that haunted the first humanity now returns. If evolution was stopped once, who says it won't be stopped again? The ancient boundary still lingers, not as a force in the environment, but as a question in the human mind. How far can a species push before the world remembers what it did last time? Civilization is our second attempt. What happens next will determine if it is our last.